Welcome to the 6 Feet Apart podcast, the conversation designed to help us find our way when answers seem out of reach and life doesn't make sense. We're Luke and Ben, and we want to thank everyone for joining us for episode 3.
So we started this whole conversation in hopes of creating some really safe space just to sort through some tough questions that don't often feel like they're okay to talk about out loud. And we especially want to say welcome if you're kind of skeptical about this whole God thing. You have doubts about Christianity. You maybe just feel like answers are at a distance when it comes to matters of faith. We're really glad you're here, and everyone who's listening, I hope you'll find value in what we're talking about. Welcome to the conversation. Share the video. We have a doozy to talk about today, don't we, Luke?
We're going to jump right into the discussion. We're attempting to respond to the question, how could you say that belief in God is reasonable?
Okay. Or how is anyone other than idiots believe any of this stuff?
Yeah, that would be another way to say it. Now, when you ask that question, there are at least a couple different paths that we could go down. And I think what we'll try to do is take a look at the one path. It's maybe a more common path with which some people are familiar, but then actually go down a different path. So what I mean to say is one route we could go is more of a philosophical approach, explore the case for what is maybe a theistic worldview, make some rational arguments for the existence of God or something beyond the natural world. So if we went down that path, we'd find ourselves talking about, well, how would you explain it? Because something can't come from nothing, right? Like if there was a big bang, what started the bang? What was there before that? Science can study causation, but what was the first cause? So that would be an important thing. We could talk a lot about that. We might look at the fine tuning of the world as we've studied the world, all the dials, the axis of the earth and the distance from the sun and the laws of gravity and the speed of light, all those constants. Like, why is that? Why do they just support life the way that they do? We'd probably look at the moral argument, the moral obligation, how all of us have this sense of oughtness, of what's right, what's just and fair, and what should be done. It spans every culture and every time. Everybody kinds of knows if there's a kid drowning in the swimming pool, you jump in and you say that like it's just the right thing to do. Where does that come from? Is it not just explained by evolutionary processes and so forth? Same thing with consciousness and the fact that we have subjective feelings, joy and sorrow, and the search for meaning and identity. Would those have just developed through the instinct for survival, or are those just attributed to the chemical processes in our brain, or is there something more to that? Seems certainly reasonable to think that there might be something more, that we might have come into existence by a conscious being. Or even think beauty. We might look at beautiful things. How do we explain that? They're not simply a means to an end. Evolutionary naturalism, I think, has trouble accounting for beauty and the significance of it. So if we went down that path, we look at a lot of those things, a lot of which have been very meaningful, and it wouldn't be fruitless to talk about some of those things. It's been important for a lot of people in their journey of faith, and maybe we could dive deeper into some of those another time. But anyway, lots of things down that particular path.
So yeah, and it is like a whole arena of study. It has been super helpful for a lot of people. Luke, you just said a mouthful. You just listed like 5 major things. Like, man, there's got to be an unmoved mover behind us. The tuning of the world. How do you explain all this? The more, how do you explain morals and all that? But even if you kind of chase down every one of these, right, and just really investigated that, as a lot of people have, and have found them extremely persuasive. I don't think that you're going to find, though, that it sort of chases you into a corner where you're sort of like, oh, it is absolutely, completely proves Christianity. Right. Or that it absolutely leads you to the doorstep of the Christian God that Christians claim to worship. So as persuasive and helpful as it is, we want to actually kind of talk about another direction that I think is probably even more worth our time. And tell us a little bit about that segue.
And it really comes down to Jesus, right? Like if we were going down that path and talking about all of those proofs for a theistic worldview, I feel like Jesus would be looking at us, kind of ready for us to acknowledge his presence in the conversation. Because Jesus exists as a historical figure. No serious student of history would deny that. About everybody is acknowledging he did exist in Palestine 2,000 years ago. And sources claim he rose from the dead. And no one that we know of has ever risen from the dead. Everybody knows that people die and they stay dead. So this actual historical person claims to have risen from the dead. We got to do something with that. And so, really, I'm going to invite us down kind of the other path, which is to examine the resurrection in particular. Is it reasonable to believe that Jesus rose from the dead? And then say something about what difference that makes in our original question about belief in God. And so, we'll tailor this experience to the few minutes that we have here. Lots of other sources, lots more we could say, but at least that's the path that we're going to go. So start us off there, Ben. It sounds very irrational to think someone came back to life after dying. How could you even begin to say that it would be reasonable to consider that?
Yes, yeah, great question. So the key word today is reasonable, right? Like if the whole premise of Christian faith comes down to this story about this guy who was alive and then he's dead and he's alive again, which we all know can't happen, is it reasonable?
Yeah.
And that's kind of the assumption there. And part of the reason I think that some people assume that Christianity is not reasonable is that it precisely because it's kind of too good to be true. You got this scientific hurdle about a dead man coming to life, but also it just kind of sounds like a fairy tale, you know. It's how every great story goes, right? But when you really break that down and think about it, it is true that every story that humans love and know kind of has a similar arc to it. There's typically, you start out, there's something that you're introduced to and it's good. And then, something bad happens. Something's at risk or something goes bad. And then, it either stays bad and ends poorly. That's a sad ending, what we call a tragedy. Or, oh, yay, everything reverses and ends well after all. And that's technically called a comedy, but we would just typically say that's the happily ever after or happy ending. And this desire for the story to go that way, whether in our own lives or a kid's story that we're reading at bedtime, is incredibly deep in every human person. It's like it's hardwired into us. This longing for reversal and redemption and the underdog to rise up and win the day, and the distressed one is rescued and the wrongs are righted and evil doesn't triumph and good prevails. It's just there, and
I'm
it's
getting excited right now.
I know it's a great story, and the reason is it turns out is that it's actually not just mythical or fairy tale. It connects with the human spirit because it is in fact part of the nature of reality, and so then you got this Jesus thing comes along, and it kind
The
of follows
Jesus
it.
story. Yeah, it's Jesus'
He's
story.
the ultimate underdog with no power or strength, and he's just a teacher and a lover, and everybody's great, But then, oh no, this horrible turn. He gets crushed and buried, and he's dead, and he's gone, and it's like, oh, but then, oh, there's a great reversal. He rises again, and everyone who trusts in him can do the same, and you've got this ultimate amazing story. And on the surface, you can look at it and say, well, Christianity is not reasonable because it just sounds like something, that we all made up. But when you look more deeply about it, it makes all the sense in the world. If in fact there was a God
Yeah.
who in fact built the world around his own nature that was in fact a redemptive, I'm going to put wrongs to rights, I'm going to exercise love, where do you think we get that arc and that love for that story? But from the very nature of God. And if there is such a thing as a God, well, then the way the Jesus story plays out is exactly the way you'd expect it to play out. So
Right.
in that sense, the story of Jesus is the most reasonable thing in the world. The very fact that it's what we would dare hope for if we dared to believe that our greatest dreams could come true. And it just so happens that we believe that, in fact, God has built the world with that whole narrative longing in our heart. So I think that's the first thing you have to say is just the assumption that it's a myth because it sounds too good to be true is actually as much of an argument that it is true as it is an argument that it's not.
Sure.
Now, we got to go further than that, though, because, okay, you got to, whenever you start talking about whether something's reasonable or not, you got to go back to the sources. Where's your information? What are you looking at? What do you mean? How do we even know what this story is? And so here's where, for Christians, we have to kind of quickly remind ourselves that contrary to what some people seem to think, Christianity is not just based on some myths or hearsay or a flimsy tradition or a bunch of folks made up a story, but we've got historical documents that recorded by eyewitnesses in short order, like relatively close to the time when these events actually happened. We've got a whole bunch of data about how accurate the Bible is. That sounds like a great topic for another session, Luke, where we
Sure.
could come back and talk about the historical veracity of Scripture and what we know about it. But here's what we know: the Bible we have is super accurate and close to the events themselves. And at the end of the day, when you shake it all out, it leaves you with two things. When you get down to the Jesus story, you're left with an empty tomb. They killed him, they put him in there, and 3 days later he was gone. But the second thing that's important is you have a lot of people who are eyewitnesses, not just one person giving their version, lots of people who saw Jesus before and after his resurrection. And those two things, you got to just have an answer to what you're going to do with an empty tomb and eyewitnesses who saw a resurrected Christ.
And it's important to have both. If it's only an empty tomb, someone could have stole it, right? In fact, the Gospel of Matthew says that was one of the stories that was going around was that one. If you only have sightings of Jesus after the fact, well, yeah, people then and now still, if you miss somebody, you're sad they're gone. You might have hallucinations or visions and so forth. Anyone could have verified that by going to the tomb and verifying is he there or not. So both of those things work in tandem. Plug one book real. Craig Blumberg has the historical reliability of the Gospels would be one such source to consult. Like if you're trying to get more insight into the
You can get into
testimony.
the science of it and look at,
Yep.
this isn't sort of biased reporting. It's like just know how what the ancient texts are actually like.
And it is important. These accounts were written down not centuries after Jesus. They were written down decades, which might still sound long to us because we live in a day where if anything happens, it's on Twitter and the whole world knows. Okay. So different reality then. They took very good care in an oral passing along of history. We don't think very highly of oral tradition or oral history. Like it doesn't count unless it's written down. Like that's kind of how we tend to think today. It's just not the way the world worked. And they were no dummies. I think sometimes we think that, oh, they would have believed anything. They didn't have the advancements in modern science and so forth. They knew that dead people didn't rise from the dead. And they knew you're not just going to take someone's word for it. There was, the witnesses were there. You could have asked them. The stories developed during the time when eyewitnesses were alive. Those corrective voices can and would and in fact did shape the story of Jesus.
They were still around. They were there. So it's like I was married in 1990. If I made up a story about what happened, there's a whole bunch of people that were at my wedding that could say that either did or didn't happen. And that's what we've got with the New Testament text.
Yep, that's right. Another N.T. Wright wrote a great book. It's a very long book called The Resurrection of the Son of God. I don't know if you'll read an 800-page book, but I do hope you know N.T. Wright. He's a very good speaker on behalf of Christianity and just what's going on. He's very erudite scholar and speaks some very important things. He also has, we'll put in the show notes, not only that book, but a much shorter lecture that he gives that kind of hits the high points of that, really diving into the resurrection. That's really kind of the crux of it. You talk about that story, the culmination in a lot of ways, the coming to that climax in the resurrection, which again is an eyewitness account. And that's really sitting at the center of our faith and our perspective on the world.
So if in fact the resurrection happened, it kind of changes everything. But
Yeah.
wait a second. So we've got a bunch of eyewitnesses and things were circulating close to the events, and the Bible's accurate and reliable and all that. But how do we know, Luke, it's not just wishful thinking that led a
Well,
bunch of people to kind of convince themselves? How do we know this thing really wasn't just made up? I mean, let's talk a little bit more about that because I think some people kind of assume that.
number of things. First one, there were a lot of Messiah figures during the decades surrounding Jesus. He was not some unicorn that only, there was a lot of people doing the kind of thing that he did, rallying people to the cause, revolutionaries, gonna sound like they're gonna overthrow the establishment. And they all had something in common. They were all killed. Okay. And when they were executed, there were two things you could do. Number one, go back home and just go back to life, or you find a new leader of the movement. Interestingly, that's not what happened with Jesus. The Christians continued to insist that Jesus was the leader of the movement even after his death, his very embarrassing death. They're putting out this crucified criminal, continuing to insist that he is the leader of this movement that they're a part of. I'm not sure how you explain that unless they actually did have an experience with him being alive after he was dead. And this idea about wishful thinking, they really had no concept of a resurrection like Jesus's. Some Jews denied the resurrection. and some believed in it, but it was going to be this thing at the end of time, that when God would raise the righteous, and no one had a concept of a resurrection in the middle of history that took the form of Jesus' resurrection. So it wasn't like, oh, we just really want it to be true. It's very contrary to anything.
In fact, the way the story unfolded would be about the last way they would have expected.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And they, well, they missed the point a lot of what Jesus was saying. Okay. They had no sense that, oh, this is where it was going. They weren't expecting his agenda to lead to crucifixion, much less resurrection. And so to assume that, oh, this is what they wanted, they're kind of concocting all this, is really to import some ideas into their minds that just, they really didn't have the resources there to make it up in the way that people might suggest.
Luke, another detail there that I think sometimes we overlook today is that if they were like making up a story, they sure did a bad job of doing
Right.
so, because not only do they make themselves look stupid, they like the whole thing hinges on whether Jesus is resurrected or not. And the key witnesses in that, according to all the gospels, are women. And in that culture, oh my goodness, you wouldn't have put a woman on the stand because they weren't trusted and respected in that culture and that time. And yet here we are with this kind of embarrassing truth that the first people to the tomb who go report it are women. Another sort of bit of evidence that just says, that sounds pretty authentic, and it doesn't sound like they were sort of making this up. If they did, they would have said, they would have had some credible witness report this.
Well, and think about all the other aspects of the story. It doesn't seem to be that Jesus is like fitting into the wishes of a community, like they're bending him around the things that they want, because Jesus continues to say things that are embarrassing and disruptive and surprising and confusing. I mean, nobody with a Hebrew or Greek worldview would have wanted to promote things like a crucified Messiah or this individual resurrection in the middle of history. You think about his closest followers being portrayed so negatively, all of the unsavory crowds around Jesus' resistance of political strategies and playing the power game, after military power. I mean, if you're gonna make it up, you just wouldn't make it up like this. It just seems more rational to believe that it actually happened according to the way that the New Testament is describing it.
So you use the word rationality there, and that's what we're getting at. What's the actually most reasonable explanation for, in fact, what has happened here? What's the plausible explanations we can come up with? You only have so many options, and I love what you said there. It's just like when you consider it, you got to also consider some other things about just the improbability of what in fact happened with Jesus himself. You've got this no count, no name, from a town that had a bad reputation, carpenter's son, executed as a criminal under the reign of the Roman Empire, squashed, gone, and yet rises up to gather around himself not just a handful of people, but the most explosive human or gathering movement the world has ever seen before or since. And in his wake, you've got this amazing wildfire-like growth of this movement of his that outlasted the Roman Empire and every other empire. And it just doesn't square if you say, well, he was just a good guy or some martyr or something like that. They weren't large, they were very small, they were marginalized. It just doesn't, it doesn't all add up. And I think, when you look further at these early Christians, like the people who are doing the writing in the New Testament, what could explain them going from being afraid for their life, seeing Jesus murdered and knowing I'm next and hiding for their lives, to these bold, courageous, I'm willing to speak out and stand up, and God is working through their lives? What would explain that except maybe they did have an encounter with the risen living Jesus that put such a courage in them that there's nothing they can do. If I put a gun to your head, Luke, and you're lying, you got some story you're spinning out, but I put a gun to your head and I say, what's the real story, Luke? And then you hear that gun cock, you're going to change your story. No one's willing to die for a lie. And yet you see these people willing to, they're burned at the stake, they're hung upside down, they're skewered, because they're almost like, you can do whatever you want to me because I know what I know. You got guys like the Apostle Paul, the life change in that guy alone. How do you explain that? A hater of Jesus and now just the world globetrotter missionary for Jesus. And you got all these lives that change so radically into these fearless, kind, loving people that are helping the poor and caring for the people in the plague, such as the world had never seen before. It's amazing, and it continues to this day.
Right.
You've got other religions that certainly have influence and have an impact on the world and have followings, but none of them have the influence of Christianity, where you've got over 2 billion people who claim I know that living Jesus and who've encountered him, and 50,000 people every day are becoming followers of Christ. No other faith has so extensively crossed the globe and cultural divisions of humanity and found a place in so many different diverse contexts, as you have with this. And so, what's the most plausible thing for us to explain all of that, all those changes and all that explosive movement? Well, to me, it's very reasonable to say maybe the one thing that the Bible actually says happened.
I think it does. It comes down to the resurrection. I know that it's like that for me personally. It's kind of the one cornerstone. I might say I believe in God for a lot of reasons, and I guess there are a number of reasons, but this is the one. I just think there's no better way that I can figure out to explain how history's been shaped the way it has, how the church has developed like it did, how the New Testament took the form that it did, how the arc of the story works together. Other than to just say that Jesus actually rose from the dead. I've come to believe that's the most reasonable conclusion. And so let's make a quick turn with the time we have left, Ben, to just say a little bit about why does this matter and how does it kind of come back to our question about belief in God. And so the route we've taken is to say, well, let's look at the resurrection and Jesus' claim here. And when you do that, you're looking at a Jesus who claims to fit within the story of the creator God, not just a generic God, not, God as in a general idea, but the God of Israel, who has a very specific resume, namely creating the world. And lots of other gods had claims on that, all right? And different gods had their own stories, Zeus and Baal and anyone else. This particular God, according to the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, like we call it, claims to be the God of all gods. It's a pretty crazy claim, a pretty powerful claim. And then Jesus shows up and says, when you look at me, you're looking at that God. He's fitting himself within that program, within that view of the world, within that trajectory of history. And it is a crazy claim for Jesus to say that. You'd have to write him off as a crazy person because of what he said. There'd be no reason to believe in Jesus if he wasn't raised from the dead, because he certainly wouldn't be who he says he was. So this resurrection, it's a validation really on where Jesus was coming from and what he was doing.
Right, and that validation is such a big part of what the resurrection does. It just validates everything about that story and the particular God that sent him. Now, there's so much else we could talk about other parts of this that we need to talk about. We'll maybe come back to that, but Luke. Let's talk a little more about this Jesus thing as we close, then, because there's such a unique thing about Jesus. He's this breathtakingly beautiful character who, on the one hand, was kind of self-centered in the sense that he said, it really is about me. I really am God in the flesh. And yet he was so selfless and sacrificial and humble. And he's got this unique balance of you've got to deal with me and yet selfless ministry. And no other person in history fits that bill, where they're humble and God. You've got Buddha, who was humble, but he wasn't God. Muhammad would never have claimed to be Allah. Confucius, same thing. And you've got others who were like, oh, I'm God, follow me, but they're not humble. They're just
Right.
some
They're church.
wacky
Yeah,
cult
right.
leader or something. So you're really left at the end of the day with, what are you going to do with Jesus?
What are you
And
gonna
this
do
is what C.S. Lewis, a great writer from the 20th century, he used to say that Jesus only leaves so many options open to you. You know, what you can't say about Jesus is, well, I really like him. He's a great teacher, and I respect him a lot. And I can't go along with him as the Son of God. And it's like that's the one option he actually didn't leave open to us. The old thing is, he's either is he liar, lunatic, or Lord? And either is a liar because he knew he wasn't really God, but he sure said he was, or he's a lunatic because he thought he was God, but he wasn't. He's just a little nuts in the head. In which case, what kind of moral teacher is that? You can't follow that. Or he maybe was, in fact, who he said he was. And those are the only two options he really gives to us: is deal with it. I'm saying I'm from God. I'm saying I'm what you need. you only have an option, Lord, liar, lunatic, and we kind of have to go with one or the other.
And
So
he's showing you his empty tomb to say, if you
yeah.
want some evidence about who I am and what my significance is, there it is. And so that's kind of what we're reckoning with.
So I think you've got the witness of billions of people in history who will say, this Jesus that lived and walked and rose again, I haven't seen with my eyes, but I can testify in my own experience. Um, I believe this very same thing, and I have evidence in my life, plausibility. So that's what we'd want to leave you with is Jesus. Go after Jesus. Look at him on his own terms. And if you've hung up on, man, I got some negative opinions about the church, or there's a bunch of hypocrites in the church, or you don't like organized religion or all that's don't worry about that right now. If you want to hold on to all that, that's okay. If you got hang-ups about science and all that, that's okay. But just what you need to do is you owe it to yourself. Everybody does, to investigate the claims of who Jesus is on the terms of the Bible and how it comes to us. Don't settle for somebody who kind of waves away Christianity with a caricature that doesn't really accurate. Seek out this Jesus, have an encounter, study what the Bible says enough to sort of be able to come to a decision. And here's what I think you'll find. You'll find that if you go after Jesus, man, I tell you, the things about church hurt and problems we have with institutional religion and the questions we have about science have a way of falling into place because of the larger plausibility of how much sense this whole Jesus thing makes, not only in reality, but in your own life. And this is the thing that at the end of the day, Jesus kind of brings us down and it just presents himself to us. And I think in the end of the day, Luke, we use the word reasonable. It's not just a sort of leap in the dark or flyer that sort of, won't hold up. I think it's the most reasonable and plausible explanation of reality, not just for the universe, but for my own life.
Amen. Go after Jesus. It's the most reasonable thing you could do right now. So I think that we got to stop right here. We'll look ahead to next week. We'll put some resources in the show notes. Next week, we're going to go after this and try to talk to the person who might say, I don't need God to live a good life and to build a good world. In future weeks, we'll go after kind of the challenge of evil and suffering. Like, what's God got to say for himself in light of this pandemic? So if you want to be a part of those conversations, we'd love to have you. Make sure you click that bell and subscribe to our YouTube channel and like our Facebook page. And we hope to catch you next time for 6 Feet Apart.
Bye, everybody.